In 1984, a filmmaker named Wes Craven created what would become the definitive modern nightmare entity. Not by inventing something new, but by recognizing something very old wearing a new face. The entity's name was Freddy Krueger, and he was the mayor translated into 20th century American horror. But Freddy was not pure fiction. He was based on something real, something that had been killing people in their sleep, something that the Cambodian refugee community in Los Angeles understood perfectly, but that American doctors could not explain. The deaths began in the late 1970s. Cambodian refugees who had survived the Khmer Rouge genocide, who had endured starvation, forced labor, mass executions, who had escaped to America and found safety at last, began dying in their sleep. These were not elderly people succumbing to age or illness. These were young men, healthy, in their 20s and 30s, no history of heart disease, no respiratory problems, no warning signs whatsoever. They would go to bed at night and be found dead in the morning. The Los Angeles County Medical Examiner's Office was baffled. Autopsy after autopsy revealed nothing. The hearts were structurally normal, the lungs were clear. There was no poison in the blood, no tumor in the brain, no physical cause for death. These men had simply stopped living sometime between falling asleep and dawn. But they had not died peacefully. Family members reported hearing screams in the night, brief, terror-filled cries that stopped abruptly. When they rushed to the bedroom, they would find the young man still in bed, but clearly in distress, gasping, struggling, eyes wide open, but unseeing. Within moments, he would be dead. And medical science could offer no explanation. The Cambodian community knew what had killed them. Dabbed Sog, the demon that suffocates sleepers, the entity that comes when you are vulnerable, when your defenses are down, when sleep has separated your soul from your body and left you exposed to attack from the spirit world. The traditional protections had been disrupted by the chaos of war and displacement. Many refugees had not been able to perform the proper rituals before sleep. Some had slept in positions considered dangerous. Others had been too exhausted, too traumatized to maintain the vigilance required to keep the demon away. And Dabbed Sog had taken advantage of that vulnerability. Western medicine eventually gave these deaths a name: sudden unexplained nocturnal death syndrome, SUNDS. The theory was cardiac arrhythmia triggered by extreme psychological stress. The victims were genocide survivors carrying immense trauma. That trauma, medical researchers hypothesized, could cause the heart's electrical system to malfunction during sleep, specifically during REM sleep, when heart rate and breathing are already variable. A fatal arrhythmia could occur. The heart would stop. Death would follow within minutes. This explanation fit the available evidence. It required no supernatural intervention. It was plausible, rational, scientific. But it did not explain why the phenomenon occurred almost exclusively in Southeast Asian populations, specifically Cambodian, Hmong, and Laotian refugees. Other populations who had experienced comparable trauma did not show similar death rates. Vietnamese refugees, for example, who had also survived war and displacement, were not dying in their sleep with the same frequency. And it did not explain why victims were consistently found with expressions of absolute terror on their faces. or why family members reported hearing screams, or why the Cambodian community had documented this exact phenomenon for generations, long before the Khmer Rouge, long before migration to America, as far back as oral tradition could trace. Dabbed Sog had always existed. The genocide and displacement had simply made the community more vulnerable to an entity that had been attacking sleepers for centuries. Wes Craven read about these deaths in the Los Angeles Times, and he recognized something. Not the medical explanation, not the trauma theory. He recognized the pattern. Men dying in their sleep after experiencing nightmares. No physical cause. Terror so intense it could kill. An entity that attacked when you were most vulnerable, when you were asleep and therefore unable to defend yourself. This was the mare. This was Lilith. This was Ephialtes. This was every sleep entity that had been documented across 5,000 years of human history. But now, it was happening in modern America, to real people, with bodies in morgues and families demanding answers that medical science could not provide. Craven asked himself a question. What if the nightmare entity is real? What if, in the space of dreams, you genuinely are vulnerable to something that can harm you? What if the ancient belief that sleep makes you susceptible to attack is not superstition, but truth that we have forgotten in our rationalist age? And from that question, Freddy Krueger was born. The premise of A Nightmare on Elm Street is deceptively simple. A child murderer named Freddy Krueger is burned alive by vengeful parents. He returns as an entity that exists in dreams. He hunts teenagers while they sleep, and when he kills them in the dream, they die in physical reality. The film's genius is recognizing that this premise is not science fiction. It is folklore. It is what humans have believed about sleep entities for as long as we have been human. Freddy operates by the same rules the mare operated by. You are paralyzed in the dream. Your body will not obey your commands, just like REM atonia prevents physical movement during sleep. He controls the environment, warping reality according to nightmare logic, just as your own brain generates the hallucinatory landscape of dreams. Physical damage crosses over. Wounds inflicted in dreams manifest on the body, just as medieval victims would wake with scratches or bruises they could not explain. And most importantly, you cannot avoid sleep. You can stay awake for days, but eventually exhaustion will claim you. Eventually, you will close your eyes. And when you do, Freddy will be waiting. This is terror management at its most primal. The entity you fear most is not something you can run from or fight. It exists in a realm you must enter every single night to survive. Sleep is not optional. Therefore, encounter with the entity is inevitable. But Freddy is more than just a modern mare. He is every nightmare entity combined, filtered through American culture, given a specific face and mythology. His burned face, the disfigurement that marks him as monster, as other, as something that should not exist, but does. Every culture's nightmare entities are described as hideous, deformed, wrong. Freddy's face is the visual embodiment of that wrongness. The razor glove, penetrating, violating, turning the hand that should nurture or protect into weapon. This is the incubus and succubus updated for slasher film era. Sexual violation implied rather than explicit, but the threat is clear. Freddy wants to get inside you. The razors are just the method. The striped sweater, predator in disguise. The cheerful colors hiding malevolent intent. In nature, bright stripes signal danger. Coral snake, wasp, poison dart frog. Freddy wears his danger openly, but formatted as something almost whimsical. The juxtaposition creates cognitive dissonance that enhances the horror. The fedora, the hat that numerous cultures have associated with sleep paralysis entities. The Hat Man, documented across the world, wears wide-brimmed hat and radiates dread. Freddy's fedora is not coincidence. It is folkloric consistency dressed as costume choice. And most tellingly, Freddy speaks in nursery rhyme. 1, 2, Freddy's coming for you. 3, 4, better lock your door. The sing-song cadence of childhood corrupted into threat. This too is consistent with folklore. Malevolent entities often speak in rhythmic patterns, riddles, rhymes. The Pied Piper, Rumpelstiltskin, the fairy folk who steal children if you do not know the right words to speak. Freddy belongs to that tradition. He is not a new entity. He is an old entity given new form. The ancient nightmare demon wearing a burned face and finger knives, hunting American teenagers on Elm Street instead of medieval peasants in Germanic villages. Same entity, same function, different aesthetic. A Nightmare on Elm Street was a massive commercial success. But more significant than box office numbers was the cultural resonance. Audiences recognized Freddy, not because they had seen similar slasher films, though by 1984 the slasher genre was well established, but because on some level, conscious or unconscious, they recognized the entity he represented. Everyone who had experienced sleep paralysis knew Freddy. He was the crushing weight on the chest made visible, the malevolent presence given a face, the terror of helplessness during sleep transformed into narrative. Film scholars and cultural critics noted something unusual. Freddy became beloved. Audiences loved him despite, or perhaps because of, how terrifying he was. They bought merchandise, wore Freddy masks for Halloween, quoted his one-liners. This was unprecedented for a horror villain whose entire purpose was murdering teenagers in their sleep. The psychological explanation, by giving the nightmare entity a specific face, a known mythology, a set of rules, Craven had made the formless terror manageable. You could not fight sleep paralysis. You could not negotiate with the crushing weight or the shadow in the corner. But you could understand Freddy's mythology, learn his weaknesses, imagine scenarios where he could be defeated. He was no less frightening, but he was knowable. And knowable horror is less psychologically damaging than formless dread. The anthropological explanation, Freddy tapped into archetypal patterns embedded in human consciousness. Every culture has the sleep demon. Every culture has the child-stealing monster. Every culture has the burned or disfigured entity that returns from death-seeking vengeance. Freddy synthesized these archetypes into a single figure that resonated across cultural boundaries. The film was successful internationally, not because American horror was exported, but because Freddy was recognizable to anyone from any culture who had folklore about nightmares. He was the Mare, he was Lilith, he was Dabtsog, he was every sleep entity wearing an American face. But if Freddy Krueger demonstrated how ancient folklore transforms into modern mythology through cinema, what happened in 2009 demonstrated something far more disturbing. We can create new nightmare entities, not intentionally, not through deliberate ritual or invocation, but accidentally, through collective imagination, focused through the internet. In June of 2009, an internet forum user named Victor Surge posted a simple creative writing exercise on the Something Awful forums. He had taken old photographs, black and white images of children at playgrounds and schools from the 1980s and 90s, and digitally added a tall, thin figure lurking in the background, barely visible, easy to miss if you were not looking carefully, but once you saw it, you could not unsee it. The figure was impossibly tall, It wore a black suit like a businessman, and it had no face. Where a face should be, there was only smooth, featureless surface like unfinished mannequin. Serge called it Slender Man. This was fiction. Everyone knew it was fiction. Serge had created the images. He posted the original photographs alongside his doctored versions to show exactly how he had faked them. This was collaborative creative storytelling, not hoax, not attempted deception. Everyone participating in the forum understood they were creating a fictional entity for entertainment. Within weeks, other forum users were contributing to the mythology. Slender Man stalked children. He appeared in forests. He could teleport or move impossibly fast. His arms could extend like tentacles. People who saw him too often would experience psychological breakdown, memory loss, paranoia, eventually complete mental collapse. The lore grew organically, each contributor adding details that seemed to fit the character. By 2010, Slender Man had migrated beyond something awful. Creepypasta websites featured stories about him. YouTube channels created documentary-style videos presenting evidence of his existence. Video games cast him as villain. Artists created illustrations and photo manipulations. Fan films told stories of characters hunted by this faceless entity. Everyone still knew he was fictional. This was collaborative mythology building in real time. The internet allowing thousands of people to contribute to a shared narrative the way oral tradition once built mythology over generations. But then something strange began happening. People started reporting that they had seen Slender Man, not online, not in videos or photographs. They had seen him, in person, standing at the edge of forests, in their peripheral vision, in their nightmares. These were not forum posts continuing the creative fiction. These were people claiming genuine encounters, often people who had never engaged with the original forums, who had only heard about Slender Man through secondary sources, who had no investment in the collaborative storytelling. Children particularly began reporting nightmares featuring the tall, faceless figure. Therapists documented cases of kids experiencing night terrors involving an entity matching Slender Man's description, entity they should not have had any exposure to, since concerned parents had deliberately kept them away from the online content. And then came the sleep paralysis reports. Multiple people across different continents described waking in the night, unable to move, and seeing Slender Man standing at the foot of their bed or in the corner of their room. The descriptions were consistent: impossibly tall, featureless face, black suit, absolute stillness. The presence radiated cold and dread. Some reported that he would tilt his head as if observing them. Others said he remained motionless, but they could feel his attention focused on them with crushing intensity. This was the Mayor. This was the Hat Man. This was every shadow entity that had been documented for thousands of years. But now he had a specific name and mythology attached. Now he was Slender Man. On May 31st, 2014, two 12-year-old girls in Waukesha, Wisconsin, Morgan Geyser and Anissa Wire, lured their friend Peyton Leutner into a forest and stabbed her 19 times. They left her to die. Peyton survived by crawling to a road where a passing cyclist found her. When police arrested Morgan and Anissa, their explanation was immediate and consistent. Slender Man had commanded them to kill. He had been visiting them at night for months, appearing in their bedrooms, speaking to them telepathically, promising that if they killed their friend and proved their loyalty, he would allow them to live in his mansion in the forest. He would make them his proxies. They would have power and purpose. If they refused, he would kill their families. The girls described their encounters with Slender Man with disturbing specificity. Morgan said he appeared at the foot of her bed multiple times per week. She would wake paralyzed, unable to move or scream, while he stood watching her. Sometimes he would tilt his head. Sometimes his arms would extend like tentacles. Always, she could feel his voice inside her mind, giving commands. Anissa reported similar experiences: Slenderman in her bedroom, the paralysis, the telepathic commands, the absolute certainty that he was real, that he was dangerous, that obedience was required for survival. Psychiatric evaluation diagnosed both girls with various mental health conditions: shared psychotic disorder, delusional thinking. Morgan was eventually diagnosed with early-onset schizophrenia. The legal system treated this as a case of mental illness, not supernatural influence. But the experiences the girls described were not typical schizophrenia symptoms. Schizophrenia usually involves auditory hallucinations, hearing voices. These girls described visual apparitions with physical presence. They described sleep paralysis encounters. They described entity contact, matching reports from people across the world who had experienced the Hat Man, the shadow people, the bedroom visitor who appears when you are paralyzed and helpless. They had given that entity a name: Slenderman. But the entity itself was not new. The Theosophists had a term for this phenomenon: tulpa. Tibetan Buddhism describes tulpa creation as the advanced meditative technique, visualizing an entity so consistently and intensely that it achieves independent existence. The practitioner holds the image in mind, details of appearance, personality, behaviors, feeding it with focused attention until the thought form becomes substantial enough to be perceived by others. Alexandre David Niel, a French-Belgian explorer who spent years studying Tibetan Buddhism in the early 20th century, claimed to have created a tulpa deliberately. She visualized a monk, plump, jolly, harmless. She held this image in meditation for months. Eventually, she wrote, the monk became visible not just to her, but to others in her traveling party. He would appear at camp, follow them during journeys, interact with the physical world in limited ways. But the tulpa began changing. The monk became thinner, less jolly. His appearance shifted towards something darker. David Nail realized she had lost control of her creation. The entity was no longer responding to her will. It had achieved autonomy. She spent 6 months in intensive meditation to dissolve the tulpa and return it to formlessness. The effort nearly destroyed her psychologically. Her account was published in Magic and Mystery in Tibet in 1932. Most Western readers dismissed it as exaggeration or delusion, but the concept of tulpa had entered Western occult discourse. The theory is this: consciousness is not locked inside individual skulls. Minds interact with each other and with some underlying field or medium. When multiple minds focus on the same image repeatedly, visualizing it, thinking about it, fearing it, imagining it, that focused attention can create a thought form that achieves partial existence. Not physical, not material, but real enough to be perceived, real enough to interact with consciousness, real enough to appear in dreams and sleep paralysis. Slenderman fits this pattern perfectly. Millions of people visualized him, looked at his images, read stories about him, watched videos, imagined him standing in forests or lurking in peripheral vision. That collective focus, millions of minds holding the same image, created something. Not intentionally, not through deliberate ritual, but through sheer volume of attention focused on a specific form. The tulpa gained substance. It began appearing in dreams, in nightmares, in sleep paralysis. It started doing what every nightmare entity has always done: visiting sleepers when they are vulnerable, appearing at the foot of the bed or in the corner, radiating dread, feeding on fear. And because millions of people knew the name and mythology, anyone who encountered this presence in sleep paralysis had an immediate framework for understanding what they were seeing. That is Slender Man. The ancient experience, paralysis, shadow figure, crushing dread, had been given a modern name. And that name, spoken by enough people, may have called something into being, or attracted an existing entity and given it new form, or simply created a shared hallucination so consistent that distinguishing it from reality became impossible. Which brings us to now, to 2020 through 2026, to younger generations on social media discovering that sleep paralysis entities are not historical curiosities or movie monsters, but something they are experiencing firsthand. And to the realization that the entities are remarkably consistent, despite the experiences having no coordination. The pattern works like this. Someone posts a video online describing their sleep paralysis experience. They mention seeing a tall figure with a hat standing at the foot of their bed. The video goes viral. Suddenly, hundreds of people are commenting, "I've seen him too. I thought I was the only one." More videos follow. Different users, different states, different countries. But the descriptions match. Tall figure, wide-brimmed hat, position at foot of bed or in doorway, overwhelming sense of dread, absolute stillness, feeling of being observed with malevolent intent. They compare notes. They discover they have all seen the same entity. They give him a name that spreads across platforms, the Hat Man. The Hat Man is now the most commonly reported sleep paralysis entity among people under 30. Thousands of documented experiences. Teenagers waking paralyzed, seeing the figure, feeling the dread, breaking paralysis and finding themselves alone, but shaken, convinced they encountered something real. The descriptions are precise, 7 to 8 feet tall, though perception of height may be distorted. Wearing a wide-brimmed hat, sometimes fedora, sometimes more like old-fashioned flat-brimmed hat, occasionally described as Victorian top hat, usually wearing long coat or cloak, sometimes in old-fashioned suit, never any visible facial features, sometimes described as shadow substance rather than solid material. Never speaks, never approaches during the encounter, but stands at distance, watching. The dread is consistent. Not fear generated by the observer's imagination, but dread radiating from the entity itself, pressing into the room like physical force. Experiencers describe feeling that if the Hat Man approaches, if he reaches the bed, something terrible will happen. Most are too terrified to find out what that might be. Some report that he tilts his head as if examining them. This detail appears repeatedly across reports from people who had not communicated with each other before posting their experiences. The Hat Man is the mayor. He is the shadow figure that has been documented for 5,000 years. But now he has specific iconography attached: the hat, the coat, the unusual height. These details may be culturally transmitted through online exposure, or they may be consistent features of an entity that has always appeared this way, but only now has social media platform for mass comparison of experiences. The question remains, is the Hat Man a tulpa? Was he created by collective internet attention, the same way Slender Man may have been? Or is he an ancient entity that internet communication has simply allowed people to recognize they are all encountering? The theosophical answer, both. The entity has always existed in the lower astral plane. The Hat Man iconography is human projection onto that entity, giving it specific form that makes it more manageable to discuss. The collective attention does not create the entity, but shapes how it manifests. The psychiatric answer, cultural transmission of hallucination. Someone posts about Hat Man. Others see the video. Their brains generate similar hallucination during sleep paralysis because the image has been planted. Mass hysteria enabled by algorithm. The neurological answer, sleep paralysis creates shadow figure hallucination. The specific details, hat, height, location, are random variations that happen to cluster because humans are pattern-seeking and will force consistency onto random data. But none of these explanations fully accounts for the reports from people who experienced the Hat Man before online documentation became widespread. Before the name was coined, before the iconography was established, people who drew pictures of what they saw, tall figure with hat, and only later discovered through internet search that thousands of others had seen the same thing. The entity predates the platform. Social media simply gave experiencers a way to compare notes and realize we are not alone. We have all seen him, and he is always the same. The Hat Man is not alone. Online communities have documented an entire taxonomy of sleep paralysis entities that modern experiencers encounter with disturbing frequency. The Hag, the oldest entity, documented for thousands of years, still visiting sleepers. Old woman or withered figure, long hair obscuring face, sits on chest or crawls across ceiling before dropping onto sleeper. The crushing sensation is most intense with the Hag. Some report being unable to breathe at all. Others describe feeling her hands on their throat, though no physical marks remain after paralysis breaks. She represents the medieval mare in almost pure form, unchanged across centuries. Shadow people, the most common experience. Humanoid shadows that move in ways physical objects should not. Too fast, jerky, sometimes described as crawling on walls or ceiling, often appear in peripheral vision, vanishing when directly observed. Usually multiple entities, not single figure. Some experiencers report shadow people watching them nightly for weeks or months, observing but not directly interacting. The sense is that these entities are studying humans, cataloguing behavior, though for what purpose, no one knows. The old Hag variant specifically crawls, not walks, approaching the bed in lurching, insect-like movement. This version appears most frequently in cultures with spider or insect folklore associated with nightmares. The movement triggers primal fear response deeper than the standing figures. Something about the crawling motion suggests predator, hunter, thing that should not move that way, but does. What social media has created is unprecedented in human history. Platforms where millions of people can instantly compare sleep paralysis experiences and discover consistency across reports. Before the internet, if you woke paralyzed with shadow figure standing in your room, you might tell family or close friends. Most would dismiss it as dream or stress. You would likely conclude it was unique to you, possibly sign of mental instability, definitely not something to discuss publicly. Now you share your experience online and discover 5,000 other people have seen the exact same thing, same entity, same location in room, same feeling, same aftermath of exhaustion and lingering dread. This creates validation. You are not crazy, you are not alone. This is something that happens to millions of people. The experience is real, whether the entity is external or neurologically generated. The experience itself is real and shared. But it also creates something else, a feedback loop. You post about Hat Man. Others confirm they have seen him. More people become aware of Hat Man. When they experience sleep paralysis, they are primed to interpret the shadow figure as Hat Man specifically. The cultural archetype has been established. The hallucination, or the entity, now has consistent form because millions of minds are holding the same image. This is either mass delusion enabled by algorithm or tulpa creation on unprecedented scale, or documentation of consistent entity that has always existed, but only now can be properly identified through mass data collection. Modern sleep science insists it is the first. cultural transmission creating consistent hallucination. Ancient traditions would insist it is the second, thought forms given power by collective attention. The experiencers themselves often believe the third. There is something real that visits when we are vulnerable, and we are finally able to name it. So we have come full circle, from Lilith in ancient Mesopotamia to the Hat Man on modern social platforms. 5,000 years of humans waking in darkness, unable to move, sensing malevolent presence. The names change, the explanations evolve, the protective methods adapt to each new era, but the experience remains constant. And whether you believe these entities are demons from hell, inhabitants of the astral plane, tulpas created by collective thought, or hallucinations generated by a brain caught between waking and dreaming, the practical question remains the same. What do you do when you wake paralyzed at 3 a.m. and something is standing in your room? The ancient Mesopotamians invoked angels and scattered mustard seeds. The medieval Europeans placed iron and recited prayers. The Victorian spiritualists visualized white light and called upon ascended masters. Today's generation shares their experiences online and takes comfort in community recognition. Different methods, same underlying impulse: protect yourself, assert boundary, refuse to be victim to the entities that inhabit the space between waking and sleeping. Because they are still here. Lilith and the Mayor and Freddy Krueger and Slenderman and the Hat Man. Different names for the same experience. Different faces on the same entity. Different cultural contexts for the same terror. They visit bedrooms tonight. They will visit bedrooms tomorrow. They have been visiting since humans first closed their eyes in darkness and learned what it meant to be vulnerable in sleep. The nightmare entities are not going anywhere. They are part of the human experience, the shadow self of sleep, the price we pay for consciousness. And now we must ask, what are they? Really, not the cultural explanation or neurological theory or spiritual doctrine, but actually fundamentally what exists in that moment when you wake paralyzed and something is watching you. That is what we examine next: the science, the psychology, the philosophy. The attempts to explain what 5,000 years of human experience has documented, but what no single theory has yet fully captured. What are the nightmare entities? And why, after all this time, do they still come? The science of nightmares. The entities are real. But what does real mean? For 5,000 years, humans have documented the same experience: waking in darkness, unable to move, sensing malevolent presence in the room. The consistency across cultures and centuries suggests something genuine is occurring. But genuine does not necessarily mean external, does not necessarily mean supernatural, does not necessarily mean an entity exists independently of the person experiencing it. Modern neuroscience offers a comprehensive explanation for every aspect of sleep paralysis and the entities encountered during it. An explanation that requires no demons, no astral planes, no collective unconscious. An explanation built entirely on brain chemistry, evolutionary psychology, and the peculiar way consciousness functions during the transition between sleep and waking. And the explanation is elegant, testable, reproducible in laboratory settings. It accounts for the universality of the experience through biology rather than metaphysics. But as we will discover, the scientific explanation answers the question of how sleep paralysis occurs while struggling with the question of why the experiences are so precisely consistent. It explains mechanism but not meaning. It maps the territory without fully accounting for why the map looks identical across every human culture that has ever documented the journey. Begin with the mechanism. Why are you paralyzed? During REM sleep, Rapid eye movement sleep, the stage where vivid dreaming occurs, your brainstem actively paralyzes your body. This is not malfunction. This is essential protective mechanism. The paralysis is called REM atonia, and it exists for a simple reason. Without it, you would physically act out your dreams. You would throw punches at dream attackers, actually striking your sleeping partner. You would run from dream pursuers, actually falling out of bed and injuring yourself. You would die from dream falls by attempting to flee and plummeting downstairs. REM atonia is survival mechanism. Your brainstem shuts down voluntary muscle control, leaving only the muscles required for breathing and eye movement active. Your mind can dream whatever it wants. Your body remains safely immobile. The paralysis is so complete that even if you become partially conscious during REM, you cannot override it through will. The signal from your brain telling your arm to move simply does not reach your arm. The motor neurons are inhibited at the brainstem level. No amount of mental effort can force movement. You are trapped inside your own body. This is what the ancient Mesopotamians experienced. This is what medieval Europeans experienced. This is what you experience when you wake during REM, before the paralysis has released. Not demonic binding, not astral realm dysfunction. Your own brainstem protecting you from yourself. Sleep paralysis occurs when consciousness returns before REM atonia has been deactivated. You are awake, or partially awake, but your body remains in the protective paralysis of REM sleep. Most people transition smoothly from REM to waking without this disconnect. But approximately 8% of the population experiences the disconnect regularly. Up to 40% experience it at least once. The experience is terrifying because being conscious while paralyzed triggers every evolutionary alarm your brain possesses. Paralysis means vulnerability. Vulnerability means predation. Predation means death. Your amygdala, the fear center of the brain, floods your system with cortisol and adrenaline. Your heart rate spikes. Your breathing becomes rapid and shallow. You are experiencing the full physiological response to mortal danger despite being safely in your own bed. Now the hallucinations. Why do you see entities? Your visual cortex is designed to find patterns, particularly human faces and bodies. This is evolutionary adaptation. For millions of years, the most important patterns to recognize were other humans, potential allies or enemies, and predators hunting you. Your brain became extraordinarily good at detecting these patterns even from minimal information. A glimpse of movement, a few dark shapes suggesting body outline, the faintest hint of eyes watching. This pattern recognition is so sensitive that it generates false positives constantly. You see faces in clouds, in wood grain, in random arrangements of objects. This is called pareidolia, and it is universal human experience. Better to see a face that is not there than miss a real face that might be predator or enemy. During sleep paralysis, your visual cortex is partially in dream state, still generating the hallucinations of REM sleep, while you are partially conscious. The room is dark. Your fear response is maximally activated. Your pattern recognition is hypersensitive. These conditions are perfect for creating hallucinations. You see shadows. Your brain interprets those shadows as human figures, because human figures are what your visual cortex is primed to detect when you are afraid and vulnerable. The figure appears dark, indistinct, threatening, because those are the characteristics your amygdala assigns to potential predators. The entity is not external. The entity is your own visual cortex, generating false pattern from shadow and darkness, amplified by fear, interpreted through evolutionary programming that says, if you are paralyzed, something must have paralyzed you. If something paralyzed you, that something is probably standing right there. The brain fills in the details. It creates the entity that explains your paralysis. The crushing sensation. Why does it feel like something is sitting on your chest? During REM sleep, your breathing is naturally restricted. The diaphragm functions, but accessory muscles that normally assist with breathing are inhibited by the same paralysis that prevents you from moving your arms and legs. This is why REM sleep is the most dangerous time for people with breathing disorders. The respiratory system is working at reduced capacity. When you are unconscious, this restriction goes unnoticed. But when you wake into paralysis, you become aware of the restricted breathing. You try to take a deep breath. The breath is shallow. You try harder. Still shallow. Panic increases. You need more oxygen because your heart is racing from fear. But the paralysis prevents the deep breathing that would provide it. Your conscious mind seeks explanation. Why can I not breathe properly? Something must be preventing it. Something must be pressing on my chest, restricting lung expansion. The hallucination follows the logic. If something is pressing on my chest, I should be able to see what it is. Your visual cortex complies. It generates an entity sitting on your chest. The hag, the mare, the demon that medieval Europeans described with such precision. There is no external weight. There is no entity. There is only your own restricted breathing during REM, noticed by your conscious mind, interpreted as external pressure, and visualized as the thing pressing down. The experience is genuine. The crushing sensation is real. But the cause is internal, not external. But here is where the scientific explanation encounters difficulty. If sleep paralysis is pure neurology, rematonia, hallucination, fear response, why are the specific details so consistent? Not just, I saw a figure, but I saw a tall figure wearing a wide-brimmed hat, standing at the foot of my bed radiating dread. Not just, I felt pressure, but I felt an old woman sitting on my chest, and I could see her long hair hanging down. The neurological model predicts people will hallucinate humanoid figures because brains are primed to detect human shapes. But it does not predict. People will hallucinate the same specific figure, same height, same hat, same location, same posture. Pattern recognition explains why we see faces in clouds. But it does not explain why millions of unconnected people see the same face in different clouds. Cultural transmission explains some consistency. If you have heard stories about the Hat Man before experiencing sleep paralysis, your brain might generate that specific hallucination. But what about people who experience the Hat Man before hearing any stories about him? Who draw pictures of what they saw, tall figure with wide-brimmed hat, and only later discover through internet search that this entity has been documented for decades? What about the children who describe sleep paralysis entities before having any cultural exposure to such concepts? What about the cross-cultural consistency before modern communication made cultural transmission easy? The scientific explanation works beautifully for mechanism. It struggles with specificity. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who founded analytical psychology, proposed a middle path between pure neurology and pure spirituality. Jung did not believe sleep paralysis entities were external demons, but he also did not believe they were mere hallucinations without significance. He argued they were archetypes, universal patterns embedded in what he called the collective unconscious of humanity. The collective unconscious, in Jung's theory, is not individual memory or experience. It is inherited psychological structure shared by all humans. Just as we all inherit the same body plan, 2 arms, 2 legs, 1 head. We inherit the same psychological structures. These structures manifest as archetypes: the mother, the father, the shadow, the anima, the animus, the wise old man. These are not learned. These are built into human consciousness. The nightmare entities, Jung argued, are archetypal manifestations. The shadow specifically, the repressed, denied, feared aspects of self that consciousness will not acknowledge. During sleep, when ego control loosens, the shadow can manifest. It appears as something external because consciousness cannot accept that this darkness is internal. It appears threatening because it represents everything we have pushed down and refused to integrate. The hag, in Jungian terms, is the terrible mother archetype, not the nurturing mother, but the devouring mother, the mother who gives life but also takes it away. Birth and death combined. The fear of engulfment, of being consumed, of losing selfhood. She sits on your chest because she wants to absorb you back into undifferentiated unity. The shadow people are literal representations of the shadow, the dark aspects of self you do not want to acknowledge. They watch from corners because they are always present at the edges of consciousness, waiting for attention, waiting for integration. The Hat Man. This is more complex. The hat suggests authority, perhaps father archetype, perhaps death itself, wearing the old-fashioned formal attire of the grave. He stands at the foot of the bed because he represents what awaits at the end: mortality, judgment, the void. Jung's framework explains the consistency without requiring external entities. If we all inherit the same archetypal structures, we will all generate similar manifestations when those structures become active. The terrible mother looks the same in Japan and Nigeria and Sweden because the human relationship to mother, the source of both life and ultimate mortality, is universal. The shadow looks the same because the human tendency to repress fear and project it outward is universal. This explanation accounts for why protective methods work. You are not actually banishing external demons. You are asserting ego boundaries against overwhelming unconscious content. Prayer, visualization, iron under the pillow. These work not because they repel entities, but because they represent psychological assertion of control. You are telling your unconscious, "This is my space. You may not enter here uninvited." The act of boundary setting has psychological power. The specific method matters less than the intent behind it. Jung documented cases where patients who learned to engage with their shadow during lucid dreaming found that nightmare entities transformed. The hag became a wise old woman offering difficult truths. Shadow people became guides through unknown psychological territory. Fear transformed into integration. But Jung also warned against dismissing these entities as merely psychological. In his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, published in 1961, the year he died, Jung wrote, "The spirits are psychologically real. Whether they exist objectively is a question I cannot answer. I only know that they have real effects on human consciousness, and that is sufficient reason to treat them seriously." Jung experienced sleep paralysis himself. He described entity encounters. He never fully resolved the question of whether the entities existed independently or were purely psychological projections. He concluded that the question might not matter. Psychological reality and objective reality might not be as separate as we assume. Evolutionary psychology offers another layer of explanation. Nightmares served survival function for our ancestors. They allowed the brain to practice threat response during safe sleep state. Every nightmare about being chased by predator was simulation, preparation for real chase that might occur tomorrow. Ancestors who had vivid nightmares and therefore practiced threat response nightly would survive predation at higher rates than those who slept dreamlessly. The nightmare-prone genes spread through the population. We are descended from people who were kept alive by their ability to imagine, in terrible detail, all the ways they might be killed. Sleep paralysis fits this framework. The experience of waking unable to move while predator approaches is the ultimate nightmare scenario. The ancestors who experienced this simulation, who felt the terror, who learned what that paralysis meant, were better prepared if actual paralysis occurred during waking due to injury or shock. They had rehearsed the scenario. They knew panic was death. They knew they must remain calm and wait for the ability to move to return. We inherited their nervous systems. We inherited their nightmares. The entities are echoes of the predators that hunted our ancestors for millions of years. The shadow watching from the corner is the leopard that waited in darkness. The crushing weight on the chest is the lion that pinned you while killing. The tall figure at the foot of the bed is the upright predator, another human from a hostile tribe who has entered your dwelling while you slept. These fears are hardwired. They do not require cultural transmission. They are written into the architecture of the amygdala, preserved across generations, because they kept enough of our ancestors alive long enough to reproduce. But evolution explains tendency, not specificity. It explains why we fear humanoid figures in darkness. It does not explain why we see the same specific figure, same height, same hat, same location, same movement pattern. It explains why nightmares are universal. It does not explain why nightmare entities across cultures, before cultural contact, were described with such precision that they appear to be the same beings documented under different names. Neuroscience explains mechanism. Jung explains meaning. Evolution explains purpose. But none fully explain consistency. Why Lilith in Mesopotamia, 2,400 years, BC, and the Hat Man, on TikTok 2026 AD, separated by over 4,000 years and described by people with no cultural connection, are essentially the same entity. Why protective methods that should be pure placebo show measurable correlation with reduced episodes. Why some people report seeing entities before experiencing paralysis, waking fully mobile, seeing the figure, then becoming paralyzed only when they try to approach it or flee from it. Why shared experiences occur. Two people sleeping in the same room both experiencing paralysis simultaneously and both describing seeing the same entity without communicating during the experience. These anomalies exist at the edges of the data. They are not common enough to overturn the neurological model, but they are consistent enough to suggest the model, while accurate for mechanism, may be incomplete for ontology. Which brings us to the fundamental question that neuroscience cannot yet answer. What is consciousness? We know which brain regions are active during consciousness. We can map neural correlates with precision, but we do not know what consciousness is. We do not know why electrical impulses in neurons produce subjective experience, the felt quality of being, of awareness, of existing. This is called the hard problem of consciousness. It remains unsolved. Every explanation for consciousness either pushes the mystery back a level without actually explaining it, or requires accepting consciousness as fundamental rather than emergent. If consciousness is fundamental, if it exists as a field or medium that brains access rather than something brains generate, then the nightmare entities might be real in a way that transcends both pure materialism and pure hallucination. They might be patterns in consciousness itself, thought forms as the Theosophists described, archetypes as Jung described, entities that exist in psychological space, which is real space, even if not physical space. When you experience sleep paralysis, your consciousness is in a liminal state, not fully dreaming, not fully waking. You exist at a threshold, and perhaps at thresholds, consciousness touches patterns it normally does not encounter. Perhaps the entities are always there, just at the edge of perception, and sleep paralysis is the state where the boundary becomes thin enough that we can sense them. This is speculation. This is not science. Science stops at mechanism and correlation. It cannot address questions of ultimate meaning or existence beyond measurable phenomena. But humans have been encountering these entities for 5,000 documented years. The experience is consistent enough to suggest genuine pattern. Pattern implies meaning, and meaning implies the question: what exists in that moment of encounter? Neuroscience has given us profound understanding of sleep paralysis mechanism. We know how it occurs. We know why the brain generates hallucinations. We know why those hallucinations tend toward humanoid figures in threatening positions. We know why paralysis triggers such intense fear. We can even predict with reasonable accuracy who is most likely to experience sleep paralysis and under what conditions. This knowledge helps. Knowing that the entity is hallucination generated by your own visual cortex makes the experience less terrifying for many people. Knowing that the paralysis will release within seconds or minutes prevents panic. Knowing that you are not dying, not being attacked by actual demon, not losing your mind. This matters. This reduces suffering. But it does not fully explain why the experiences are so consistent. Why every culture documents the same entities. Why protective methods that should be pure ritual show correlation with reduced episodes. Why some experiences deviate from the neurological model in ways that suggest external rather than internal agency. The scientific method requires reproducibility, measurement, falsifiability. Sleep paralysis meets these criteria. You can study it in laboratories. You can measure brainwaves during episodes. You can correlate conditions with likelihood of occurrence. But the meaning of the entities, what they represent, why they appear, what, if anything, they want, this falls outside scientific method. This requires different approaches: philosophy, comparative mythology, phenomenology, the study of subjective experience on its own terms, rather than reduced to neural correlates. Science tells us how nightmares work. It cannot tell us what nightmares mean. For that, we must turn to older forms of knowing. To the philosophers who asked, why do humans fear death so intensely that we create demons to embody that fear? To the contemplatives who asked, what does it mean that consciousness encounters its own shadow? To the traditions that asked, what exists in the liminal spaces between waking and sleeping, between life and death, between self and other? These are not scientific questions. But they may be more important questions, because the nightmare entities do not care whether science can explain them. They continue visiting. They continue appearing at the foot of beds, in corners of rooms, pressing down on chests of paralyzed sleepers. Science has mapped the territory, but the territory remains dangerous. And those who walk it, who experience sleep paralysis, who encounter the entities, who wake in darkness with something watching them, need more than mechanism explained. They need meaning. They need context. They need understanding of why this keeps happening, and what, if anything, they are supposed to learn from it. That is where we turn next, to the philosophy of sleep, to the meaning of nightmares, to the question of what the entities might be teaching us if we can learn to face them with courage rather than terror. Because perhaps the entities are not enemies. Perhaps they are mirrors. Perhaps they show us what we most need to see, but least want to acknowledge. And perhaps learning to face them in sleep is preparation for facing something larger, something that waits for all of us, something sleep paralysis rehearses every time it occurs. The ultimate paralysis, the final entity, the presence that visits when all movement stops and breathing ceases. Death itself. Sleep, death, and the entities we need. Every night you practice dying. This is not metaphor. This is literal truth that ancient philosophers understood and that modern neuroscience confirms. When you sleep, you surrender consciousness. Your sense of self dissolves. time becomes meaningless. You have no control over the experiences that follow. You forget that you are asleep. The dream feels real while it is happening. And when you wake, hours have passed that you cannot account for. Hours during which you effectively did not exist as conscious being. This is identical to death as far as your subjective experience is concerned. The only difference is that you wake. Socrates, standing trial in Athens in 399 BC, shortly before he would be executed by drinking hemlock, addressed his judges and made an observation about death that has echoed through philosophy for 2,400 years. Death is one of two things. Either the dead are nothing and have no perception of anything, or it is, as we are told, a change and a relocating for the soul from this place to another place. If it is complete lack of perception, like a dreamless sleep, then death would be a great advantage. Socrates was sentenced to death. He drank the poison, and his final recorded words were not fear or regret, but practical instruction to a friend. Crito, we owe a rooster to Asclepius. Please, do not forget to pay the debt. The philosopher approaching death treated it as he would treat sleep. A transition to be entered calmly, with affairs settled, with no terror about what followed. Why? Because he had been practicing. Every night when he slept, every period of dreamless unconsciousness was a rehearsal for the ultimate unconsciousness. Sleep had taught him that non-existence was not frightening. You are not aware of time passing when you do not exist. You do not suffer during dreamless sleep. Death, if it is annihilation, would be the same. Permanent dreamless sleep. Not terrible, not painful. Simply the absence of consciousness, which you have already experienced thousands of times. But if death is not annihilation, if consciousness continues in some form, then sleep is still the practice. Because dreams show you what consciousness without body feels like. Time distorts. Logic fails. Impossible things occur and feel normal. You encounter beings and places that do not exist in physical reality. This is what consciousness does when freed from the constraints of physical form. Medieval Christianity understood this connection between sleep and death so clearly that prayers before bed were explicitly framed as preparation for dying. The bedtime prayer taught to children across Christian Europe included the line, "If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take." Every night, the possibility of death was acknowledged. Every morning, waking was recognized as temporary reprieve. Sleep was the threshold. Death waited on the other side. You might cross that threshold tonight and not return. This was not morbid obsession. This was practical recognition of reality. In the medieval world, death could come at any moment. Disease, accident, violence. The average life expectancy was 30 to 40 years. Children died with horrifying frequency. Sleep was genuinely dangerous because you might develop fever during the night and never wake. But the acknowledgement of death's proximity served psychological function. If you contemplate death every night before sleep, death loses some of its terror. It becomes familiar, expected, part of the natural rhythm of existence. Sleep and death are siblings, one temporary, one permanent. Both involve surrender of consciousness and control. The nightmare entities fit into this framework. They appear during sleep, the death-adjacent state, to remind you that you are vulnerable, that you are not in control, that something waits in the darkness that you cannot fight or escape. They are death's messengers, death's rehearsal, death wearing various faces to prepare you for the final encounter. In 1973, cultural anthropologist Ernest Becker published The Denial of Death, a book that would win the Pulitzer Prize and reshape how psychology understood human motivation. Becker's central thesis was radical. Nearly all human behavior can be understood as an attempt to deny or transcend mortality. Humans are the only animals that know they will die. We have sufficient intelligence and self-awareness to understand our own mortality. We know that we are temporary, that consciousness will end, that we will cease to exist, and this knowledge is psychologically unbearable. So we build defenses against death awareness. We create cultures that promise immortality, either literal immortality through religion, or symbolic immortality through legacy, achievement, reproduction. We build monuments. We create art. We have children who carry our names. We join movements larger than ourselves. We convince ourselves that we matter, that our lives have meaning, that we will be remembered, all to avoid confronting the simple fact: we will die, and then we will be nothing, and the universe will continue without us. Terror management theory, developed by psychologists Sheldon Solomon, Jeff Greenberg, and Tom Pischinsky in the 1980s and 90s, built on Becker's work. They conducted hundreds of experiments demonstrating that when people are reminded of death, even subtly, even unconsciously, their behavior changes. They become more defensive of their cultural worldviews, more hostile to people who are different, more desperate to feel significant, more willing to spend money, take risks, make grand gestures. Death anxiety is the underground river that shapes human psychology. We do not think about it constantly, but it is always there, generating currents that push us toward behaviors we do not fully understand. The nightmare entities are still here, in corners of rooms, at the feet of beds, in doorways and shadows, waiting for the moment when your consciousness drifts into the vulnerable space between waking and sleeping. They have been here for 5,000 years. They will be here 5,000 years from now. They are part of what it means to be human, part of what it means to have consciousness that must regularly surrender itself to unconsciousness and hope to return. They are demons, or archetypes, or hallucinations, or teachers. They are death wearing different faces. They are the price of consciousness. They are the shadow self of sleep. And they are not your enemies. They are reminders, messengers, the guards who stand at the threshold between sleep and death, testing whether you are ready, whether you have learned, whether you can face what waits with courage instead of terror. Most nights, you will sleep peacefully. No paralysis, no entities, no terror. These are the easy nights, the nights when death seems distant and abstract, when mortality is intellectual concept rather than visceral reality. But some nights, 8% of people regularly, 40% at least once, the entity will come. You will wake unable to move. You will see the figure. You will feel the crushing weight. You will experience the terror that humans have been experiencing since we first became conscious enough to understand our own mortality. And in that moment, you have choice. Panic or recognition. Victim or student. Terror or courage. The entity will wait while you decide. Memento mori. Remember, you must die. Not as threat, not as curse, but as liberation. Because if you remember that death is coming, that consciousness is temporary, that you exist only for brief span between birth and grave, then every moment becomes precious. Every relationship becomes urgent. Every kindness becomes essential. Every breath becomes gift. The nightmare entities bring this message. They are memento mori made manifest. Death's ambassadors sent to you while you sleep, to remind you while you can still do something about it. Your time is limited. What will you do with it? This is why the entities come. This is why they have always come. This is why they will always come. Not to harm you, not to terrorize you, but to wake you up, to shake you out of the comfortable delusion that you have infinite time, to force you to confront what you spend waking hours denying. You are going to die, and therefore, live. now, fully, while you still can. The entities are teachers. The lesson is mortality. The test is courage. And every morning you wake after facing them in the night. Every time you survive the encounter, every time you practice dying and return to consciousness, you pass the test a little better. You learn a little more. You become a little more prepared for the day when the waking does not come. That is what the nightmare entities are for. That is what they have always been for. That is why, after 5,000 years, they have not stopped coming. And why, 5,000 years from now, they will still be here. In corners, in darkness, in the vulnerable space where consciousness meets its own mortality, waiting, teaching, reminding us, memento mori, remember you must die, so that you remember to live.